I want to thank everybody for being here today. Can you hear me all right? Good. On top of my work with Freedom Project and good people like Joe, I've also been a university professor for the last 20 years. And I got involved with Common Core because over the last 10, 12 years, by the time kids get from high school to me, by the time I get students in my college classes, it's shockingly how anti-American they've become. It's shockingly how much they despise capitalism. They think it's evil. It's amazing how many of them have lost their faith. And so I got involved with Freedom Project primarily because it dawned on me that if I was going to make any difference at all, we had to start trying to get to kids at earlier levels. Common Core is going to do to your public school, your elementary schools, your middle schools and high schools, what has happened already to your universities for the last 20 years. They have become places of radically intolerant, one-sided ideology. And that's why we really have to fight Common Core, because they're going to start coming after your kids with the ideology as young as 5 years old. We want our education to be ideology-free. We want our kids to become what they're meant to become. We want them to make up their own minds. Common Core is going to prohibit that in a very important way. There's a couple of disclaimers I like to make before I give these talks. And the first one is, I don't know if we have any teachers here today, but we do, good. This talk is in no way, shape, or form meant to be anti-teacher. I have a tremendous amount of sympathy for our teachers, particularly our public school teachers. They didn't ask for any of this. When you think about Common Core, the first thing you got to remember is nobody's voted on this. Not moms and dads whose kids are suffering with it, not the teachers who have to teach this, not the principals who have to administrate it, not the superintendents of schools, not the school boards, none of your state administrators, not your governor. Nobody in any of these states had anything to do with this. In fact, I'll be making a few comparisons over the course of the night between the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and Common Core. Mainly because in order to get our minds around the government taking over something as big as education, it's the only parallel we have. Right? And say what you will about the Affordable Care Act, say what you will about Obamacare, fact is that it had a hearing in the Congress, it had a hearing in the Senate, and it had a hearing before the Supreme Court. Common Core has had none of those things. I think it is every bit as dangerous and transformational in terms of how the individual is going to relate to the state as Obamacare is. And so we'll talk about that moving forward a little bit. So I've got a lot of sympathy for our teachers. I have met many teachers. I've given now, I first heard the words Common Core about 11 months ago. And in 11 months now, I've given 180 talks in 32 different states. And it's simply because no one else was doing it. I started off giving a couple talks. I happen to be Catholic. So for some reason, 176 Roman Catholic diocese schools in this country adopted Common Core without even being asked to. They've gotten rid of all their classical textbooks, right? Of course. Yep. I'm one of them. Yep. No, and I tried to be specific. There's quite a few dioceses in the country. 176 is well over half of them, and they have all taken it. And in our state of Wisconsin, to give you an example, 10 months ago, all 5 Catholic bishops in Wisconsin had Common Core in their schools. Now there's only 1 left. So progress is being made. So the idea here about Common Core, 10 months ago, I didn't know what it was. And I started giving some talks to local Catholic school groups who were worried about it, and no one else is doing this. That's the other thing. If Common Core is as good as they tell you it is, if it is absolutely without doubt the wave of the future, how come they don't come and talk to you? There are activists all over the country like me giving thousands of talks, and yet the people who are for Common Core, they never come and address groups like this. And they don't have to because it's the law now, but they don't. They don't explain it very well. The other thing I want to say about Common Core, just the last thing by way of introduction, is this is a tremendously bipartisan problem. This is not a Democrat problem. It's not a Republican problem. In all the states that I've been in, all 32, it depends on who's controlling government. Yours, obviously, is a very Democrat, a very liberal state. And so actually, the problem is really owned by the Democrats. In my state of Wisconsin, Republicans control the legislature, the House, the Senate, and we've got Governor Scott Walker, who is a conservative governor. And in Wisconsin, the biggest trouble we have in trying to get rid of this is Republicans. And the reason both Democrats and Republicans support this is because of all the federal dollars that come with it. Nobody, not even California, would have taken this mess if they weren't getting paid a lot of money to do it. And so it's even a bigger problem than that. So the last thing I do when I start is, let me ask you, how many of you as you sit here today, you're 3 years, almost 3 years into Common Core in your schools now? 2 full years, 1 solid year of implementation. It was fed into your schools even before you realized it last year. This whole scheme was conceived back in 2008 and 2009. They've been working on it nonstop for 6 years now. As you sit here today, let me ask this question by a show of hands. How many of you, as you sit here today, would argue that at best your understanding of what Common Core is very fuzzy? How many of you would argue you're please just look around, right? This is the case. I've given talks to as many as 1,200 people in one room and as few as 10 and 12. Every single talk of those 180, it's been the same thing. 95% of the audiences in places from California to Boston to North Dakota to Florida and Texas. Nobody knows what it is. How in the world can this have been done to you? And nobody knows what it is. That's our first warning about Common Core. So let's start with, given where we're all starting at with a little bit of uncertainty about what Common Core is, let's start with the basics. What is Common Core? Common Core is an abbreviated term used to refer to the Common Core State Standards Initiative, a set of national standards for English and math. That's all we have so far, with science forthcoming. Science has been written, and they're already beginning to feed it into your schools. They intend to make every single school subject, including art, music, and gym class, conform to Common Core, which means your gym classes now are going to come chock full of Common Core ideological stuff, which I'll show you coming up. Right? Even gym class is going to be impacted. And before we even get halfway through that first sentence, we got to stop. They call it the Common Core State Standards. That would lead you to believe, wouldn't it, that the states had something to do with this? But they didn't. I've already given you the overview. It's the same reason, with all due respect, I think they decided to name the health care law the Affordable Care Act. Because we're all for affordability, right? Have we seen any affordability in it yet? No. But when you and this is true of both political parties, when you take big the federal government seizes power to itself, it always gives their big plans these names, right? And Common Core, right? Who can be against one common standard for everybody? But they call it the Common Core State Standards, but the states had nothing to do with it. The standards were paid for, drafted, revised, finalized, and put in 46 American states before anybody in those states had a chance to even look at them. And those states, including California, that after they were put in your schools, after the state had taken it, after the money had come into your state, sure, some of your teachers were allowed to look at the standards. But they weren't allowed to change them. They weren't allowed to revise them. They certainly couldn't veto them, the teachers, if they didn't like them. So they call them the Common Core State Standards. Let's talk about naming here. They tell you, right, that English and math are what you now have. So badly are the words Common Core branding across the country, so unpopular is it, that they've changed the name of all the subsequent standards. So every other standard you're going to get after English and math won't be called Common Core. The science standards are now called the Next Generation Science Standards. And they will keep changing the names, counting on the fact that most Americans, if they don't hear the word Common Core, they'll think it's gone. So again, I want to ask you as we start, if Common Core is so obviously wonderful, if it's just so clearly superior, why don't they tell you why it is? Why don't they come and talk to you? If the presentations that people like me are giving all across the country are really not serious, then shouldn't they be able to dispel it in about 2 seconds? And why are they changing the names of everything? And why didn't they consult you when they put it in? And why is it 2 years after this whole thing got started that you have to come to hear me? Why do I have to fly from Wisconsin to tell a group of wonderful California people what it is? Because they won't do it. Where's your transparency? We haven't even started the talk yet. And you got to ask yourself, right? You're smart enough to know that if they're doing all of this, then there's got to be problems, right? And so they call them the Common Core State Standards. Science has been already renamed to Next Generation Science. And who wrote them? Who owns the standards that your kids are suffering with right now? 2 Washington lobbyist groups. 2 Washington lobbyist groups. The National Governors Association and the CCSSO. Now, when you hear the phrase National Governors Association, it's awfully tempting to imagine 50 state governors locked in a room with their sleeves rolled up, banging out education standards. Now, that would be better than what we have, because you can always unelect a governor. I guess unless you're Jerry Brown, you can run anytime you want. But you can always, in theory, unelect a governor, right? The thing that's so odd about it is that these two Washington lobbyist groups are utterly unaccountable to you and me. If you don't like Common Core, if your state decides it doesn't like Common Core, how are you going to get at the people who wrote it? I'll show you something shocking. Here is the actual copyright for Common Core. So the educational standards now that are beginning to transform American education, they're not owned by the moms and dads or the teachers teachers' unions. They're not owned by the states. They're not owned by your politicians. They're not owned by your governors. They're not owned by the Congress of the United States. They are not owned by the Department of Education. They are owned by two Washington lobbyist groups. Here's the copyright. The NGA Center and the CCSSO shall be acknowledged as the sole owners and developers of Common Core, and no claims to the contrary shall be made. How in the world does this education, how do private individual citizens who've never been elected or voted into anything, how do they get to own this? How do they get it into your schools? How in the world can these guys change the face of American education? And are you happy with that? Even if you think Common Core standards are good, how can we accept this process? The NGA, I mentioned the 50 state governors. When you hear a term like National Governors Association, it's tempting to imagine all the governors doing it. And the only reason it would be better than what we have now is because you could vote them out. You can't vote these guys out. But what qualifications does Jerry Brown have to write educational standards? What qualification does Scott Walker have to write educational standards? They have none. Zero. In fact, here's an interesting statistic for you. You know who the president of the National Governors Association is? That's the governor of Oklahoma, Mary Fallin. And Mary Fallin, just last week, and the entire state of Oklahoma voted to get out of Common Core, right? So think about that. The woman in charge of the NGA, the lobbyist group who gave you Common Core, she just pulled her entire state out of it. What does that tell you about the standards? Now, what happened? Written and copyrighted. And I see some of you taking notes. I think that's fantastic. Let me tell you that the good pastor is recording this talk. And so you're going to be able to get copies of this on DVD from him. And at the end of the talk, I'll throw up a website too. I want you to have every single slide I'm showing you today. So at the end of my talk, if you don't want to wait for Pastor King to get it to you, I think he'll have it at 7 a.m. tomorrow morning, right, Pastor? About 1 million copies. He'll get it to you. And if not, you'll be able to go right to my website and get them. I beg you to do one thing for me. Please verify my information. Do it. Take it. Because once you hear what I have to say and take the slides, then it's your information. Then you don't need me anymore. But if you do that, and 180 talks, I have not had a single person, I throw this challenge out there all the time. If you find that I say something or that there's something I show you that's not true, you tell me. 180 talks I've talked to about, I would bet over those 180 talks I've talked to about 80,000 Americans. Small number, right? A lot of traveling for a small number. Barely even certainly wouldn't fill Oakland Coliseum. But it's important. So if you find anything, call me on it. And if you don't, then here's what I want you to do. I want you to promise me that you will hold the people who argue for Common Core to exactly the same standard. Make them prove to you that the nonsense they're telling you is true. They won't do it. That's why they won't come and talk to you, because they don't have a leg to stand on. But I'll put that website up at the end. So you got the national, and for those of you taking notes then, there's a name I want you to write down. It's Joy Pullman, Pullman. Joy is at the Heartland Institute in Chicago. She has written the definitive argument, the definitive article, tracing Common Core back to 5 individuals. In these two Washington lobbyist groups, 5 individuals wrote the standards. Here's one more name for you, the chief of whom is David Coleman, Coleman. This man is, and look him up, this man is not qualified to write education standards for anybody. David Coleman was a roommate of Arne Duncan, our Secretary of Education, in college. That's the only reason he has the job. David Coleman has never been elected to anything. Arne Duncan, by the way, your Secretary of Education, does anybody know what he majored in college? It wasn't education. Sociology. Why in the world would the president appoint to the Department of Education a sociologist, not an educator? Well, you're going to see now. You're about to see. Common Core is not an educational curriculum. It's a sociology curriculum. It's not going to teach your kids better. It's not going to make them learn more. It's not going to make them excel and get them college ready. What it is going to do is use 8 hours a day, every day in your private public schools. Your public schools and many of your private schools. 8 hours a day, every day. It's going to push your kids farther away from you and closer to government. That is what it's about. You got a sociologist running the Department of Education. You got David Coleman, who has no qualifications to be writing education standards. And no sooner did David Coleman oversee these 5 individuals as they wrote the standards, then he immediately left Common Core. You know what David Coleman's doing right now? He is the CEO of the College Boards, where he is right now transforming the SAT exams to conform to Common Core. How's that for incestuous? How in the world does the unelected guy with no experience, how in the world does he get to write the standards and then immediately go to the College Boards, where the exams your kids are going to have to take to get into college are now being transformed to Common Core? How in the world does that happen? And how does it happen in a republic like we have here? How does that happen? None of these people have been elected to anything. And if you get a chance to look at Joy's article, she'll give you the other 5, and I'll mention a few more of them in the course of the talk. All right. So what do we got? We got the 2 Washington lobbyist groups and 5 members of those lobbyist groups who wrote the standards. Well, who's paying for all this? Well, that's where we get Bill and Melinda Gates, right? The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, back in 2008 and 2009, gave to these 5 lobbyists, gave them about $150 million to write the standards. Here we are 5 years later. Right now, Bill Gates has spent about $3 billion on Common Core. The only thing Bill Gates has spent more money on than Common Core is abortion and birth control, population control in Africa. That's it. $3 billion Gates has spent on Common Core. And if you type in Bill Gates Common Core money into Google, because his foundation is a 501c3, it's a public operation, it's a charitable operation, you can see where he spent all that money, every penny of it. Do you know that before the standards were even written, Bill Gates had doled out millions of dollars of grants to the national PTA, the Parent Teachers Association, supposed to be looking after our kids? Before the standards were even written, Gates had paid millions of dollars to the national PTA to begin lobbying for and advocating for Common Core. We mentioned why so many Catholic schools have taken Common Core. Well, the NCEA, the National Catholic Education Association, the largest Catholic watchdog group for Catholic schools, they've received hundreds of thousands of dollars in grants from Bill and Melinda Gates. The Chambers of Commerce, the National Chamber of Commerce, has received over $6 million in Gates money in the last 2 years, all to promote Common Core. Right? And we haven't even got to the money the feds are spending on it. So Bill and Melinda, and let me ask this question too. I'm asking you a lot of rhetorical questions. What qualifies Bill Gates to write education standards? Isn't this the guy that dropped out of college to go open a company in his own garage? And God bless him. I hope he makes another $1 billion. I hope he spends it better. But God bless him, right? But this is a guy who dropped out of college because it wasn't teaching him anything. He didn't need it. What qualifies him to oversee this project? So that's how it happened. That's how you got it. But there's one piece missing. How did it get into your schools? These 5 lobbyists couldn't have put it there. And look, you've been watching the American federal government for the last 25, 30 years. This is an American federal government, whether it's headed by Republicans or Democrats, that is very, very jealous of its own territory, right? It doesn't let people do things that it should be doing. Do you honestly think these 5 lobbyists and Bill Gates, with all of his billions, could have forced the Department of Education to take these standards? No. There's only one way these things got into your schools. That's because the federal government put them there. And how did they do it? Race to the Top. How many of you remember the Race to the Top program? Yeah, right. Well, back in 2008 and 9, it's President Obama's program. What did he do? Remember when he was stimulating things, giving lots of taxpayer money to banks and car companies? Well, he wanted to stimulate education, too. So initially, back in 2008-09, President Obama created Race to the Top. He set aside about $6 billion to give of taxpayer money to simply give to the states. Give you an example. New York State, back in 2009, applied for Race to the Top money and received $700 million. And that money went straight to New York's education department. They could spend it on tetherballs or hot lunches or teacher salaries, whatever they wanted. $700 million. Do you know what the only provision in taking that money was? And by the way, 46 states in the union ended up getting some kind of Race to the Top money. And do you know what the provision is for that? We'll give you all that money. You don't have to ever pay it back. You can spend it on whatever you want for your education, for your schools. The only proviso is if you take Race to the Top money, you have to accept Common Core standards when they were finally written. That's how 46 states in the union got Common Core without ever having seen the standards. And California is one of those states. You think about this. So now you got the federal government, right, on top of this, basically bribing 46 states with your money, bribing 46 states to take a set of curriculum standards that they hadn't seen. And you want to know what? When you do meet people who support Common Core, they won't ever talk about this. What they'll say is, well, now, Dr. Pesta, let's just talk about the standards. They're just standards, Dr. Pesta. Wait a second. It matters how you got them, doesn't it? Let me ask you a question. Do you think the people in California who support Common Core would support it if they were exactly the same standards? But instead of, let's say, Bill Gates, what if it was the evil Koch brothers who put up $2.5 billion for these? And what if instead of two left-leaning lobbyist groups, you had two right-leaning ones? And what if instead of a very liberal president, you had a very conservative one who basically bribed states to take a bunch of curriculum standards that they hadn't seen? Do you think your California state, do you think Boxer and Feinstein, do you think Jerry Brown, do you think your teachers, do you think they would take it? I got to tell you, I would be just as bothered by these standards if they happen that way, just as annoyed by them. It would never have been allowed to stand. Can you imagine if the Koch brothers paid for this? I think Harry Reid's head would explode all over the Senate floor. Right? If you've been paying attention to his Koch diatribes all the time. What entitles them to do this? And why would the federal government do this? Well, because of a 1965 federal statute. The federal government is not allowed to create national standards or national curriculum. The feds can't do it. It's illegal. So they did the next best thing. If you look at the 5 people responsible for Common Core, including David Coleman, all of them have deep ties to the Department of Education and to the president. Coleman himself is a big money bundler for the president. I mentioned that Coleman was the roommate of our education secretary in college. This is it. You couldn't do it that way. And that's why this is really shocking. This is really shocking. This copyright. This is Banana Republic stuff. This is third world tin pot dictator stuff. That you completely circumvent federal law, you get a bunch of your cronies to put together standards that you legally can't do, and then you put them in the schools by offering states a bunch of money simply to adopt a set of standards that they one day will write. It's not acceptable. And how do you get rid of it now? And you play this kabuki dance. When you point this out to people, well, let's just talk about the standards. And then when you go to talk about the standards, or mention the federal involvement in this, they point to the copyright. The feds didn't do this. But again, keep it in mind. It's the Race to the Top program, the federal program, that if you took that money, you had to take the standards. And that's how all the states got it. As a matter of fact, that's how you get punished. I mentioned Oklahoma and the president of the National Governors Association pulling out last week. South Carolina pulled out last week, too. Indiana became the first state to pull out. There were 4 states that didn't take it to begin with: Nebraska, Alaska, Texas, and Virginia. And so when Indiana pulled out, they were the first one to pull out. The federal government, who's not involved in Common Core, the federal government went to Indiana and said, oh, you can pull out, but if you do, we're going to withhold your entire federal education budget for next year of $220 million. So the feds, who aren't involved in this, they bribed states to take it, and now they're blackmailing states who try to get out of it. But it's not a federal curriculum. Yeah, that proves it, right? It's not a federal curriculum. There's the copyright. Do you see the kabuki dance here? You point to the copyright, you point to Race to the Top, and they point to the other thing. There's 3 parts to Common Core that you absolutely have to understand. I've given you 2 of them. One is the committee, funded by the Gates people. The other is the Race to the Top program, the way the feds put it in. The third piece of the pie that will be coming in a moment is the textbook companies. Do you know who the second biggest donor to Common Core is, private donor outside of Bill Gates? That would be Pearson Publishing. Pearson Publishing owns 80% of the American textbook market right now. They own 100% of the Canadian textbook market, all of it, all of it. The CEO of Pearson is a guy by the name of Sir Michael Barber. He's a Brit. He has spent in the last year alone, he's bought 40 different American small presses, paying 4 and 5 times what they're worth. Oh, and just so we get the record straight here, 2 weeks ago, Pearson Publishing was awarded by the federal government an exclusive contract to write, grade, and administer every single Common Core test in this country through PARC and through Smarter Balance. Guess what Pearson makes on every single test they administer? $30. What's 60 million times 30? Being an English professor, that number eludes me, right? But that's a lot of money, isn't it? $30 a test Pearson gets. Oh, maybe that explains why they are the second biggest private donor. So that's how we got it. I have one last little history lesson to help put this all together. How many of you remember the big federal government education program that preceded Common Core? What was it called? No Child Left Behind. And in the spirit of absolute bipartisanship, who was the president that gave us that little piece of work? George Bush, absolutely. George Bush didn't write it, though. Who did? Ted Kennedy. George Bush gave the education bill and let Teddy Kennedy and his people write it. So Ted Kennedy wrote No Child Left Behind back in 2002. And I got to tell you, No Child Left Behind has been a screaming disaster. I have never yet met a single teacher, a single principal, a single superintendent of schools. Everybody involved with education absolutely hates No Child Left Behind. And why do they hate it? For 3 reasons. One, it's outcome-based education. And what does that mean? It means every different school district is different. Every rural schools versus inner city schools, right? Big city schools versus small private schools, they're all different. And the kids you get in all those schools are different. And what they know is different. And what they're able to do is different. So rather than deal with the kids, let your teachers deal with the kids they have in front of them the best way they can, because we've got teachers here. You know it, right? The good teachers are the ones that sometimes have to throw the curriculum out. If it ain't working, do something else. Outcome-based education, on the other hand, and we've had some form of outcome-based education in this country ever since the Department of Education was created in the late 70s. Because once the Federal Department of Education was created under the Jimmy Carter administration, the department has nothing else to do but assert its authority, right? It has to justify all these billions and billions every year that get funneled into it. You know, we're spending almost as much on education now as we're spending on defense. The Army can shoot straight. Can your kids write straight? So this is what happened. And outcome-based education is we worry about not where kids are. We don't let teachers deal with the kids they've got and work to the best of their ability to help those kids. It's about where kids end up, right? We set these standards. For a long time, they were state standards. That didn't work. So the feds, we could never get in any of the states most of the kids in the states to meet the state standards. So what's the genius federal argument? Let's make it a federal standard. Let's forget how many millions that live in California? What's the population of California? 30 million. We couldn't get 30 million Californians, that's probably about 8 or 9, 10 million kids. We couldn't get those kids to the California standards. It's impossible. So let's create a national standard for 60 million American school kids. How many of you have kids or grandkids? Which is to say all of you. Can you get all 4 of your kids or all 7 of your grandkids, can you get them to perform at exactly the same level in every subject area? Oh, of course you can't. You can't do it. And if you can't do it with your own kids and your own grandkids, how are you going to do it with all those 60 million kids? It's impossible. And why would you want to? Why in the world are we starting from the premise that all of our kids need to be in exactly the same place in exactly the same subject area? It doesn't make any sense. For 50 years we've been doing this. That's why we hated No Child Left Behind. We also hated No Child Left Behind because if you have this arbitrary, and don't get me wrong, I like standards, but this is part of the argument. If you oppose Common Core, you just don't want standards. Remember when you heard that if you oppose Obamacare, you just want people to die in the streets? And if you don't support the latest radical feminist agenda for abortion, it's a war on women, right? This is the way, it's so frightening, this is the way debate works in this country. Do you understand this much? You do. That education has always been about standards. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower. If you're giving kids tests or quizzes or assigning them grades at the end of a term, you've got standards. This notion that Common Core for the first time is going to give us this great national standard. Here's another piece of information for you. And Joy Pullman talks about this. There is not a shred of evidence, no zero zip statistical evidence, no mathematical evidence that simply having high standards, low standards, or any standards in your state or in the country has the slightest impact on how your kids behave in the classroom. You could slap any standard up there. It has no bearing on anything. And as a matter of fact, the minute you start slapping these standards up there, what's the only way you can get more kids to the standard? Higher them or lower them? Lower them. So for 12 years, that's what happened with No Child Left Behind. They started with a national standard, and every year your kids couldn't get there because it's an arbitrary exercise anyway. So every year the standards got lower and lower. Wherever you think Common Core standards are starting, doesn't it have to be the same way? They will have to lower them because you can't possibly get kids to this. And why are we doing this standards-based outcome education to begin with? One more thing. If all you have is the national standard, that's the only thing we care about. Do your kids get there or don't they? What's the only way we have to measure whether or not your kids get to the standard? Tests. High stake. You remember when we were kids? You took the Iowa basics for 2 days in March, and that was the end of it. Your kids are testing for weeks and weeks and weeks now. You've got third and second and fourth graders seriously suffering from test anxiety now. The business of psychology for little kids now, because of all this ridiculous testing, is absurd. Endless tests. And by the way, they call it high stakes testing. Who is it high stakes for? Teachers. Look, I want teacher accountability. We need good teachers. But again, if you can't get your 4 kids to the same level in all the different subject areas, how can you expect your teachers to do it? Your teachers who get 30 new faces every semester, right? Kids with radically different backgrounds and radically different ability levels. How in the world are you going to expect your teachers to do that? That's why how many of you remember what happened over the last 5 or 6 years in places like New York City and Atlanta, Georgia, and North Carolina? You remember all those scandals where you had teachers, principals, and even 2 superintendents of school who were taking the kids' standardized tests, dumping them in the trash, and forging new ones. Because if you're a teacher, you don't get tenure, you don't get to stay if you can't get the kids to the standard. If you're a principal whose school doesn't meet the standards, they pull you out. I understand why they did it. But what exactly do the tests prove? There is no evidence for this. So they hated, what did they hate No Child Left Behind for? They hated it because of the high-stakes testing, the outcome-based education, and they hated it because it's one-size-fits-all education. If you're going to get every American school kid to the same place in math, it's not going to be a very high place, is it? It can't. Look, I'm an English professor. The reason I'm an English professor is because I radically suck at math, to tell you the truth, all right? I can't add or subtract my way out of a paper bag. But so what? Doesn't the world need more than CPAs? The only way you get your kids across the board to where the standard is if you ignore the kids who can move ahead in certain areas and you ignore the kids who fall behind in other ones. Look, do you know we've lost more gifted and talented education programs in this country in the last 2 years than in the last 40 combined? Well, why? You understand, right? That when you have a simple, hard standard, it's every bit as dangerous for kids to succeed the standard, to go beyond it, as it is for them to fall behind. If kids start excelling, your kid's really good at math. In fact, very few kids are, but you've got one. You've got a kid who can do really advanced math. Why not let him do it? But now that skews the standard. If you've got a bunch of kids who are going ahead in math, it's pulling the standard up, isn't it? And by definition, if the standard gets higher, you're losing more kids at the bottom. That's why we're killing off gifted programs, talented programs, letting kids who can do it really move ahead. And so what are you doing to those few kids, relatively speaking, who can do serious math? You're destroying it for them. You're not helping kids like me. You could lower the standard as low as you want to. You're not going to make me like math. Meanwhile, the kid who can really do math and accelerate, he is utterly flummoxed by this, lost. Whatever interest he might have had in succeeding is utterly stifled and choked in the name of the standards. Right? And this has been true for 40 years. So why am I telling you about No Child Left Behind? Because here is my definition of Common Core. Common Core is nothing but No Child Left Behind on steroids. All of the worst aspects of No Child Left Behind, the outcome-based education, the endless meaningless standardized testing, the one-size-fits-all approach, that's exactly what Common Core is. So what was it that killed off No Child Left Behind? Why did No Child Left Behind fail? Because there was a design flaw in Teddy Kennedy's program. And the design flaw was it left way too much state and local control. It gave teachers in working classrooms too much authority. And so what the teachers did in conjunction with the moms and dads who knew it wasn't working, they raised holy hell. They pushed back against it. And that's why No Child Left Behind died. Because at the ground up, it was so impractical and so nauseatingly bad that the teachers finally managed to stifle it. Well, that's the one thing that gets fixed in Common Core. Why do you think it is? Remember where we started tonight. Why do you think it is nobody told you about this? Why do you think it is your teachers were given no say in developing the standards? They were given no say in writing the tests. They don't even get to grade the test. Pearson does it. You think about that. The tests that are going to measure your kids' performance were not written by teachers and will not be graded by teachers. How can you hold your teachers accountable for tests that they can't even see. And by the way, there are 3 states in the Union that have had Common Core longer than you, longer than most states. Florida, New York, and Kentucky. Those are the 3 rollout states for Common Core. They've had Common Core 3 years before you got it. They've already gone through 2 full years of Common Core testing, and now all 3 states want out, desperately. New York's test scores in reading and math fell from the 79th percentile all the way down to the mid-30s. And the tests that were offered to New York and Florida and Kentucky school kids, Pearson will not release them. So you can't even find out what questions your kids got wrong. The teachers of New York found this out. They took their tests, which they didn't write. The tests were graded, not by the teachers. And now Pearson will not release the tests. So all your schools get is the score of your kids. Now, think about that. Your kids fail tests, but your teachers aren't allowed to see the tests to see what the kids failed. That's Common Core, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why New York, a state that rivals you for mindless liberalism in some ways, all right? They're the East Coast version of you. And they want out desperately now. So does Florida and so does Kentucky. All right. Moving a little bit forward here. There we go. And I want to show you something, if I can get my clicker right. You need to know that the protest to Common Core began in 2009, before any of you heard what the word is, before they'd even written the standards. The 2 chief lawyers at the Department of Education, the 2 top guys, they quit over this, calling it a federal takeover of education. These 2 guys, as a matter of fact, have since written a book. It was just published last month. I haven't even had time to read it yet. You know what the title of their book is? The Coming Federal Takeover of Education. I'm looking forward to reading it. Here's what they say. The race to the top application, the initial vehicle through which Common Core was imposed on the states, that race to the top requires the applicants, the states that took the money, to, quote, adopt a set of content standards that are substantially identical across all the states in the consortium. This means that states must adopt Common Core word for word. They may supplement the standards, the states, but only if the supplemental material doesn't exceed 15%. So, well, that sounds good. We can take Common Core in California, but we can do 15% more. That's a good compromise. Wait a second. If California gets to do things 15% differently than Wisconsin does, and Wisconsin gets to do things 15% differently than Ohio does, how in the world are you going to test that? Don't you need 50 different state tests? And the feds have already said you're getting one national test. So what do you think is going to happen to that 15% extra that you do? You think it's ever going to appear on the exams? No. And that's what New York found out. The first year, New York teachers took that 15% clause and used it to unteach all the garbage that was in Common Core. And then they got their first tests. And not a single thing was represented from that. That's what you're dealing with here. Go back quickly a little bit more. Here's what these 2 lawyers had to say. In imposing the Common Core standards and the test, the aligned tests, and let me stop here to remind you, the 2 things that make Common Core undeniably federal and national is how they put them in your schools, race to the top, because without that it wouldn't happen, number 1. And number 2, the tests. All the tests report right back to the Department of Education. They're ultimately controlled by the feds, not by the states, not by the teachers. That's it. And that's why these 2 lawyers quit. In imposing the Common Core standards and the aligned assessments on the states, the federal government is violating 3 statutes and has put America on the road to a national curriculum. With respect to the race to the top Common Core scheme, Robert S. Eitel and Kent D. Talbert, former Deputy General Counsel and General Counsel, respectively, of the U.S. Department of Education, concluded that, quote, these standards and the tests will ultimately direct the course of elementary and secondary school in most states across the nation, the ones that took it, running the risk that states become little more than administrative agents for a nationalized K-12 program and raising, the last line is chopped off there, and raising a fundamental question about whether or not the Department of Education is exceeding its own statutory boundaries. And you understand this too? You do not get to be the chief lawyer at the Department of Education if you're a tinfoil hat wearing right-winger. You just don't. These guys are not right-wing closet ideologues. They're big-time liberal Democrat Department of Education lawyers. And they quit over this because it's a clear violation of the federal mandate. I want to talk to you for just a couple minutes about this, because the only argument you ever get from the pro-Common Core people is simply that the people who oppose Common Core are right-wing nut jobs. That's it. That's the only argument they will give you. They don't debate this stuff. They don't argue it. They don't challenge it. They don't even pretend that it didn't happen this way. But they simply dismiss anybody who protests Common Core as an extreme right-winger. If that's the case, then I feel it necessary to show you some of the extreme right-wingers who are opposing Common Core. It's cut off there. This is the New York State Teachers Union. The New York State Teachers Union wants out. By the way, help me out here with a little linguistic problem. The New York State Teachers Union, is there any way you can rearrange those 6 words to make it come out conservative? Is there any way you can get New York State Teachers Union and right-wing conspiracy? I didn't think so either. Here's what they said in January of this year. The Board of New York Teachers Union on Saturday, the 27th of January, 2014, unanimously voted to withdraw its support for Common Core state standards as they are being implemented, and they also declared a no-confidence vote in the Commissioner of Education for the state of New York. The New York State United Teachers, a union which represents more than 600,000 educational professionals in New York, is also asking the State Board of Regents to remove State Education Commissioner John King Jr. from office. And although it previously backed the Common Core standards, the union says it will not support the education benchmarks as implemented or interpreted. They want no part of them. And they want the guy who brought them to the state fired, because they've seen it for 2 years. See, California, you have not had your first tests yet. We haven't had ours in Wisconsin. You're going to get them next spring. And what's going to happen to you is what will happen to you is what happened to them. When your teachers and your administrators see just what those tests are, it's going to break loose, right? But, if you wait until next spring to really get active about this, that's the thing. You're never going to kill these from the top, from the bottom. No Child Left Behind was killed from the bottom, right? From the bottom. It was killed from the bottom. This won't be. That's why none of you know about it. And in fact, it's staggering. When you talk to teachers across, I don't know about your state, but I've talked to teachers in 30 different states, hundreds, thousands of them. They don't even know what Common Core is. This is why you're never going to get rid of it from the ground up anymore. It's a totally top-down program. And how about that? You like that one? How about this one? How about the NEA? The largest teachers union in the entire country, and the most powerful union. Now that the UAW has been tamped down, the teachers union, the NEA, is the most powerful in terms of money and influence union in the country. Here's what they said February of 2014, a couple months ago. The nation's largest teachers union is pulling back on its once enthusiastic support for Common Core, labeling the rollout, quote, completely botched, unquote. National Education Association President Dennis Van Roekel said, quote, the standards will not succeed without a major course correction, including rewriting the standards and revising the tests with teacher input. Yeah, you heard that right. The president of the NEA, right? There was no teacher input. Your teachers have to teach your kids, but they didn't write the test. They had no say in it. They don't get to grade the test. They have no say in it. They can't change the tests. You understand why the teachers union, that bastion of kooky right-wingery. But here's my favorite. 1 month ago, May 7th of this year, how about the Chicago Teachers Union? The most radical progressive teachers union in the country, and in President Obama's own backyard, nonetheless. Now, let's keep in mind how radical the Chicago Teachers Union is. This is the teachers union in Chicago that 2 years ago voted in a curriculum that would mandate the teaching of masturbation skills to 5-year-olds. Kindergarten. This is the left-wingery, the right-wingery of the Chicago Teachers Union. So here's what they had to say. 1 month ago, this is what they had to say. There we go. That woman, if you could see her in the bottom left-hand part of the screen, that's Karen Lewis. She is the president of the Chicago Teachers Union. Karen is the kind, you should please, if you're taking notes, go look her up. It's amusing. If you bumped into Karen Lewis on the street and you went up to her and said, hey, Karen, you're farther left than Bill Ayers, the terrorist bomber, she would thank you for the compliment. She would see it as an absolute, right? She's out there. And last month, this is what she said, and her entire Chicago Teachers Union said about Common Core. I agree with educators and parents from across the country. The Common Core mandate represents an overreach of federal power into personal privacy, as well as into state educational autonomy. This is an opportunity for the federal government to get all kinds of data on your kids, number one. And number two, it will kill whatever educational freedom you have in the state. If Common Core gets fully implemented, how are you what purpose are your state and local school boards going to serve? Everything's coming from Washington. What are you going to do? Right now, even under No Child Left Behind, as bad as that was, if you have a problem with a book your teacher's teaching, or a lesson, or a sexuality topic, or a movie, you can go to your schools, and you can talk to your teacher, and 99 times out of 100, you can opt your kid out, easy peasy. How are you going to opt your kid out if everything in the curriculum is tested to the standard, the national tests? And it's all controlled by Washington. You're going to go to your teacher, she's going to send you the principal, who's going to send you to the superintendent, and somewhere along the line, somebody's going to give you the number for 1-800 Department of Education. How much Muzak do you think you're going to have to listen to before Arnie Duncan picks up the phone? And this is Karen Lewis telling you this, right? The Common Core represents an overreach of federal power into personal privacy, as well as into state educational autonomy. And by the way, do you honestly believe that some paradigm drafted in Washington, D.C. knows better how to teach your kids than your schools and you as moms and dads do? You're going to turn this over to them? That's what she's telling you. Common Core, she goes on, direct quote, Common Core eliminates creativity in the classroom and impedes collaboration. We also know that high-stakes standardized testing is designed to rank and sort our children, and it contributes significantly to racial discrimination and the achievement gap in our nation's schools. And she's right. You know which schools are going to be really hard-pressed by this? Inner city schools. You know which kids are going to really be sacrificed on the altar of this nonsense? Kids who already are behind. Because it's all, do you know the federal government is already talking about the possibility of institutionalized schools? Any kid that can't meet the standards, any kid that's got ADHD or a learning disability or for whatever reason can't get there, they're already talking about pulling those kids out of the public schools and creating institutional, sanatorium-type schools for those kids because you can't have them screwing up the standard. That's fascist. That's what the Nazis did. Any kid who couldn't cut it, any kid who couldn't buy the theory, any kid who couldn't get on board with the abstract sociology, they were just put in institutional schools. That's already been brooded about twice at the federal level. That's what Karen Lewis is reacting against. How about this? Not only did Karen Lewis put this out personally, but the entire Chicago Teachers Union drafted a list of resolutions, all of them unanimously, hundreds of thousands of them, about why Common Core won't work. I can't show you all 12 pages, but I'll show you a couple of them. Here's what the CTU people said. The Chicago Teachers Union, the CTU resolution declares that, quote, instructional and curricular decisions should be in the hands of classroom professionals. Whatever your kids are learning, it should come from teachers. It didn't with Common Core. Should be in the hands of classroom professionals who understand the context and interests of their students. And the education of children should be grounded in developmentally appropriate practice. As we'll see in about 2 minutes, if you've been paying at all attention to Common Core, one of the most shocking aspects of it is how graphically sexual, graphically violent, and altogether developmentally inappropriate for kids it is. It is shocking. And I want you to pay attention to this, because by the time I'm done, you will have heard from Department of Education lawyers, you will have heard from teacher unions, you will have heard from actual teachers, you will have heard from all sorts of people who it's really hard for you to write off as right-wing kooks. They're telling you this. I could spend, and for every one of these I can give you 5 sources on the right that blast this for the same reasons. But for whatever reason, we seem to live in a culture where if you make assertions on the left, we take you seriously. If you make them on the right, we ignore them. But it gets even better than this, right? This is, go on with this. She says, all right, classroom professionals should have the decisions. They didn't. And education should be grounded in developmentally appropriate practice. This hasn't been. Common Core standards were developed by non-practitioners. Who wrote them? Test and publishing concerns. Test and curriculum publishers. And educational reform foundations, like the Gates and Broad foundations. That's who wrote them. These are all people who make money writing new books every couple of years. They make money on the tests. Do you think there's a conflict of interest there? You know who else opposes Common Core? That other right-wing group that can't stand Common Core? The Occupy Wall Street movement. When I think of Occupy Wall Street, I think of, staunch conservative voters. And why does Occupy Wall Street oppose it? Because of the crony capitalism involved. It's been estimated that up to 70% of American school districts will have to upgrade a little or a lot to be able to accommodate the kind of testing Common Core requires. Whose computers do you think are going into those schools? Think they're going to be Apple computers? This is a big deal. So who did it? Common Core standards were developed by non-practitioners, including test and curriculum publishers and education reform foundations like the Gates Foundation. It says that the resolution says, as a result, quote, the standards better reflect the interests and priorities of corporate education reformers than the best interests and priorities of teachers and students. That's the Chicago Teachers Union. Come on. There we go. I'm going to skip this one. I'll just talk you brief. I won't read it all, but I'm going to simply show it to you. Do you know on the tests in New York, Florida, and Kentucky, the ones that your kids are going to take, there are all kinds of product placement logos? Did you know that? Nike, the World Cup soccer officials, they're all, when your kids sit down to take their English test, they're going to be bombarded with advertisements. Maybe I should read it. At least, here's the thing. New York kids took their test last spring, and nobody was allowed to see them. Only people that saw the test besides your kids were the few teachers who proctored the exams. And so they're reporting what they saw. Pearson will not release the tests. At least a half a dozen companies got an unexpected boost in marketing their brands to New York children. This is the New York Times. In marketing their brands to New York children this week with free product placement in the state's English exams. Teachers and students said that the multiple choice section of the 8th grade tests name-dropped at least a handful of companies or products, including Mug Root Beer, Lego, IBM, and FIFA. Now, Pearson will not tell you what they're getting paid for this. But do you honestly think Pearson is putting these companies in the tests if they're not getting paid for this? You understand why those crazy right-wingers who occupy, when Occupy Wall Street, when they're not busy pooping on cop cars and throwing bricks to windows, right, they're opposing this nonsense. 1 out of 3 ain't bad. The International Soccer Federation were all mentioned in the test booklets, and some of them with what educators refer to as actual trademark symbols. I've been giving this test for 8 years and have never seen the test drop trademark the names and passages, let alone note the trademark at the bottom of the page, said one teacher who administered the exam. Right? This is the corporate influence behind it. Do you understand now why big corporate entities like State Farm Insurance and why they support Common Core? They do. This is Joshua Katz. He and I are about as far apart as we can be ideologically. He is a New York State math teacher for middle school kids and elementary and middle school kids. I want you to take a quick minute and listen, because he's doing the same thing I'm doing. He's going across the country doing this as a teacher. Now, I want you to listen briefly to what he says, because A, we're very far apart. I want you to get a divergence of views here. But I also want you, he says a couple of things that I want him credited for because they're pretty powerful. Talking about the corporate influences.
Our toxic culture of education begins with a classic supervillain archetype. I focus on Syndrome from The Incredibles. The supervillain's plan is to unleash a doom onto the world that only the supervillain can stop, thus gaining all the desired power. Now, this is exactly what happened in education in the 1980s and before, and then culminated in No Child Left Behind. Private education companies realized they could use public education, a multi-billion-dollar industry, to create a nearly endless stream of taxpayer money. They channeled millions of dollars into lobbying efforts and focused on 2 words, rigor and accountability, and put everything into place. State statutes were passed, district rules were enforced, and then finally No Child Left Behind became the national standard. Don't get me wrong about politics. These efforts were underway long before they were passed, so both parties get to take full credit for their disastrous results, especially with Race to the Top. We somehow took the education system that produced the individuals who put a man on the moon with technology less powerful than the phone in my pocket and characterized that education system as a failure, using the word accountability. We only have one way to address accountability: standardized testing. So we implemented standardized testing. And then a 1983 publication called A Nation at Risk showed standardized tests proved schools were failing, teachers were failing, students were failing. And when everything is failing, guess what we need? New textbooks, new workbooks, new resources, new training, accountability systems, new schools, private schools, charter schools. And who is it that creates all of these things that all of a sudden we need? Our supervillain, private education companies. The only way to feed a business model in this toxic culture of education is to perpetuate a picture of failure. I would love to meet any education company that has a business model that is built upon long-term student success. There simply is no money in long-term student success. Now, how is it that we can believe that a standardized test is what accurately measures student achievement? How can we believe that it measures student growth? That moment when the student's light bulb is finally lit, aha. That moment when a student says, thank you for helping him graduate with a 2.0 GPA. How can we attach a number to that moment when a third grader finally has the ability to write his own name? Who, by the way, has been labeled a failure for himself, his teacher, and his school. Yet we crave education standardization. We believe we need these high-stakes tests because we eat up the misinformation provided by these companies and policies using a false validity of their testing results. Our testing culture begins in elementary school. Colleagues of mine work with third graders who suffer from anxiety from high-stakes testing. From a one-day, one-shot, 4-hour computer-based test, the future path of a student is set, an academic identity is established, and a message is delivered loud and clear: either you can or you can't make it. And no matter what the teacher tells the student about how good they are or what talents they have, if the student doesn't score well on that high-stakes test, the third graders know exactly what it means and begin to define themselves. And it's starting to happen now in kindergarten. So we continue this barrage of standardized tests, and the students continue failing, and the districts have to continue the next initiatives that can solve the problems. Who is it that manufactures these products? Who creates these solutions? Our supervillain. Private companies like Pearson and McGraw-Hill, who operate off policy and legislation written by nonprofit organizations and lobbying groups like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. The Common Core will do even more damage because of its emphasis on high-stakes testing matched with its myopic standards that are disguised in critical thinking. I've seen my daughter's kindergarten and first grade assignments. This isn't critical thinking. This is developmentally inappropriate rote. You think they can fool me with this stuff? Any education reform that doesn't address high-stakes testing and the non-cognitive factors of true success like character and integrity is a complete waste of time, and it's killing our kids.
And he's right. And I'll tell you one thing I disagree with him about. It's a fair disagreement, but the supervillain, the ultimate villain for him is the textbook companies. I don't think that's true, because if the federal government didn't want the textbooks in the schools, it never would happen. So the real problem is both. There's plenty of blame to go around on that. But two things he says I just want to underscore. He's right. The American schools were the best schools in the world. The same schools that put a man on the moon with less technology, he says, than you have on your cell phone. That's a shocking thing to think about. Those schools were all branded failures back in the 70s and 80s. Who branded them failures? It wasn't the teachers who called them failures. It wasn't the Department of Education who did it. It was these testing companies. They put forth tests that said, hey, our kids are failing. And so now every 2 and 3 years, brand new textbooks have to be purchased. Brand new tests have to be created. You see, and the other thing he said that is really important, there is no long-term money to be made for education standards at work. Look, we've been teaching math the same way for 2,500 years. It's given us Euclid. It's given us Newton. It's given us Einstein. It worked. But if we do it the way we've always done it, your school can buy one math textbook and use it for 100 years. But there's no money in that, is there? That's why all this ridiculous new math you're seeing, they even call it new math, all this tortured, convoluted, utterly counterintuitive math that your kids are suffering through now, it's merely a money-making scheme, and it has nothing to do with helping your kids, right? And how about, let's listen to the man himself. How about Bill Gates? You think your teachers and some of your administrators are telling you, no, we can take Common Core and we can fix it. We can use it as a baseline and go beyond it. We'll have lots of control. Well, listen to what Bill Gates said back in 2009, before this whole thing got started. He said, and I quote, "When the tests are aligned to the standards, the curriculum will follow as well." You see what that means. That you've got the standards, and they're pretty meaningless right now until you have your tests. When the tests align with the standards, your teachers will have to teach only to the tests. Why do you think Chicago backed out? Why do you think the New York Teachers Union backed out? Why do you think the NEA wants out? Because for all this talk about state and local control and you can take the standards and make them your own, no, you can't. And the man who paid for them told you that. That the job of Common Core, when we finally get the tests in place, will guarantee that your teachers can only teach to the tests. Whoever controls the tests controls your kids. And it's not even the Department of Education right now. It's Pearson. Think about that for a second. And pay attention to who wants out of this, right? All right, let's talk about the standards. We've got English and math, and we have so much evidence now to demonstrate why they are failures. You need one last short history lesson. The Common Core people did one other thing that you might be tempted to think was a good idea. Back in 2010, after the standards had been paid for and drafted, they put a committee together of 29 people. That committee was called the Validation Committee. And the job, everybody on that committee was given full power to look at the standards for English and math and to get rid of them if they didn't like them, throw them out, change them, whatever they felt they needed to do. The panel was completely empowered to act. Here's the interesting thing about the Validation Committee. 29 people. They brought in only one math expert and one English expert. That was it. A lot of low-level educators, sixth grade math teacher, and that's no insult to sixth grade math teachers. If you're a sixth grade math teacher, we need good sixth grade math teachers. But you understand that being able to teach sixth graders math does not provide you enough math to be able to write a national standard that covers all our kids. That's math at a high level. So they only brought in two experts, one math professor and one English professor. The math professor is a Californian, a man by the name of Jim Milgram. He's a serious dude. He's a retired math professor, taught at Stanford. He's the guy that wrote most of the math calculations for the Apollo moonshot in the late 60s. Most of the math, he did it. He was the guy they hired to survey the math standards. And the woman responsible for the English language arts standards is Dr. Sandy Stotsky. She lives in Massachusetts now, and she helped create Massachusetts state standards. Massachusetts is the only state in the union, if you pull it out of the United States and put it up against the rest of the world, they finish in the top 5 in everything. Only one. I'll tell you a little bit later how they did it. Sandy put those together. They brought her in. Do you know Stotsky and Milgram both voted absolutely no on the standards, tried to throw them out? They were so compelling, they convinced other people to vote no. Sandy said, and I quote, "Common Core English will set our kids 2 years behind the 2 years they're already behind the rest of the world in reading and comprehension." And Professor Milgram said, quote, "It is an absolute joke to think that Common Core math will prepare your kids for college-level math or for STEM careers. Science, technology, engineering, and math. It's an absolute joke." You know how you keep hearing from the supporters of Common Core? Well, these standards have been internationally benchmarked. When we put the math standards together, we looked at all the high-achieving countries in the world and we modeled it after them. So when Professor Milgram got to the committee, he said, "That's great. What countries did you use?" And they handed him a list. Sweden and South Korea, right, the really good math countries. And Milgram said, "Oh, good, you got all the right countries. Now show me your data. Show me what you did. How did you measure them? What did you do?" And for the entire month he was on that committee, they never, ever produced a shred of evidence. And to this day, as we sit here now, no one anywhere has seen any evidence at all that any statistical analysis was done comparing this to any of it. Sandy said, "I'm convinced on that committee, I'm 100% convinced they wrote down the names of high-achieving schools, and that's as far as they got, and stuck it in a drawer, because we saw no evidence that all this is new. It's never been tested, ever." In fact, the only part of Common Core that's ever been used anywhere in the world is the geometry curriculum. And that was used by the Russians about 3 years ago. They used the Common Core version of geometry for about 6 months before they unilaterally threw them out of the schools as a complete failure. That is the only part of Common Core that has ever been tested or utilized. So Milgram voted no, Stotsky voted no. And as an English professor, we'll start with English. I can talk about this quite easily. I'm very comfortable as an English professor talking about this. I just keep jumping ahead of my slide, though. Go back a little slide. There we go. This is derived directly from Sandy. And at the end, when I give you that website, you can go to that website and watch Dr. Stotsky testify in Wisconsin. We brought her to Wisconsin. Watch the whole thing. Watch Dr. Milgram testify in Wisconsin. She testified the whole thing, right? You can watch that all free of charge. So the big problem with Common Core English, among other things, is 50% of the classic literature that kids usually read in English class, the books that familiarize them with 2,000 years of our Judeo-Christian heritage, the books from American literature that show them over the centuries, right? The evolution of American identity, the quest and the struggle for liberty, that's being yanked out. Up to 50% of that is gone to be replaced by informational texts. These informational texts are almost exclusively government documents. Your kids now, instead of reading Moby Dick or instead of reading To Kill a Mockingbird or Huckleberry Finn, are going to spend a lot of time reading Department of Environmental Protection Agency pamphlets, President Obama's own executive orders. And by the way, Sandy is another one. She's a good Yankee Democrat, no right-winger. But she says this is absolutely about indoctrination. They're pulling out literature in English class, and they're replacing it with federal government pamphlets, almost all of which have to do with man-made global warming and America's role in destroying the planet. For kids as young as 3rd and 4th grade, almost the entirety of what they're reading outside of literature is how America's destroying the planet. I'll give you one example. In Wisconsin, right before I came out here, we gave a talk, and a mom was there, and she had 100 pages of short stories that her kids in 3rd grade had just spent a month reading. Do you know what the premise of all of them was? Every one of those stories? 16 short stories, 100 pages. The premise was that in a few years, America will have destroyed the planet. And when America has destroyed the planet, then what's going to happen is all this rape and incest and cannibalism. And these stories went on for 100 pages in graphic detail for 3rd graders. What was going to happen when we destroyed the world? 3rd graders. She's going to send, I'll put slides up as soon as she sends them to me. Here, I'll give you a couple examples. That was the slide I just had up there. Here, when your kid gets to be a freshman in high school, here's what he's going to be reading. How about recommended levels of insulation? A report released in 2010 by the US EPA and the Department of Energy. In other words, I've seen it. It's a long manual about how to environmentally correctly insulate new buildings. It's 40 pages of regulation. How about, by the time your daughter's in 10th grade, President Obama's own Executive Order 13423, strengthening federal environmental, energy, and transportation management. How about the evolution of the grocery bag? That's one of my favorites. Spoiler alert, in case you want to rush out and read it. Paper and plastic are both bad, and America's destroying the planet. And there are dozens and dozens of these, and there's no critical thinking. It's not like you're going, here is the argument for and the argument against. No. It's all one-sided propaganda. We also know Common Core English. We also know that kids learn how to write only after they learn how to read well. It makes sense. When you sit down to learn a foreign language, you don't start writing it. You got to start reading it. Well, Common Core at every age level, Common Core lowers the overall level of reading by 50% and raises the overall level of writing by 50%. They are writing more than they're reading. They're writing in math class more than they're doing math problems. And if you've got kids writing who haven't read much, what do you think they're writing about? Maybe that's how you got the assignment from my state of Wisconsin that went viral a couple months ago, when 4th graders were sent home and told to write an essay explaining how the state was just like the family but better. That was the essay assignment. And so Stotsky's point is that this is indoctrination. It's bad pedagogy. When you're asking kids to write who haven't learned how to read well, you are filling their minds with things they should say. All right? That's what the problem with the English is. Oh, and what about what little literature is left in Common Core? How about this? Why is so much of the literature that's left in Common Core utterly sexually and developmentally inappropriate for your kids? This is just one book. This is the most famous one. Now, this is Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. She is an amazing writer. African-American novelist. She won a Nobel Prize. But we wouldn't teach this book to freshmen in college. It's serious. It's about a 12-year-old girl who's the victim of rape and incest. And over the course of the book, she comes to bond with her rapist and describes in shockingly graphic terms the sexual encounters between the two of them. He's in his 40s, she's 12. The book has been in 2 and 3 dozen now Common Core classrooms across the country. It's been in Catholic Common Core books. For kids as young as 8th grade, they've had to pull this out. I blocked out the words, but I'm going to have to show you. Take just a quick look. Take a quick look. I blocked out the words. You probably can't see it all that well, but if you can make it out, this is just a small sample. There are other books like Dreaming in Cuban and Black Swan. There are dozens of them as Common Core exemplar texts that are shockingly sexually graphic, describing intimate sex acts in great detail. And that's just for the high school kids. For the lower level kids, I'll give you an example for the lower level. Obviously, they're not having third graders read pornography, but what they are doing is almost as shocking. There's a famous, this just happened about 2 weeks ago, there's a famous internet example that just came out. You can see it. In a 4th grade classroom, third or fourth grade classroom, little kids were sent home with a homework assignment. They were given a long paragraph, and they had to read the paragraph and then write down what the main point of the paragraph was. In other words, they had to read a paragraph and infer the topic from the reading. Well, here's the way the paragraph read. Julie comes home from a hard day at work. She finds that once again her husband hadn't made the bed. So Julie sets about making the bed. And in the course of making the bed, Julie finds a hair beret in the bed that's not hers. And by the time you get 6 and 7 sentences down, the kids must conclude that dad is having an adulterous affair in mom's bed. That's what the 4th graders have to conclude from that. Why? Sandy asks a really good question. She says, why? There's Dr. Sandy. She says, why? We need to explore why so many of these exemplar texts are out of place, not just in the subject area. Why are you reading about insulation in English class anyway? Not just in the subject area Common Core places them, but in a high school curriculum altogether. Why? I'm going to let that hang for about 5 minutes because there's an answer for why it's so sexual. We'll get there. Just a minute. All right, but before we do that, we must take a quick, you got to have a little bit of math in this as well. Well, as bad as English is, I think it probably pales in comparison.
But even under the new common...
Sorry, set it up. Real quick, math. We asked Professor Milgram when we had him, and he's a Stanford guy. We had him when we had him in Wisconsin, spent a lot of time talking to him. And so none of this was ever internationally benchmarked. None of this was ever tested before. And have any of you been watching, if you just type in Common Core math into Google, you will find tens of thousands of examples of absolutely loopy math. This has gotten so big it's even hitting the Hollywood crowd. Do you know who Louis C.K. is, the famous comedian? Well, he's got 2 kids in elementary school. And so he was on the David Letterman show about a month ago, and they spent an entire half an hour. He held up the absolutely absurd math assignments. And he and Letterman were just ripping into it. Stephen Colbert, another Hollywood lefty, right, spent a whole 20 minutes on his show lambasting Common Core math. I asked Professor Milgram, what is the purpose of this curriculum? He directed me to this video. This video, and you can't make this up, she's a community activist and organizer from Chicago, and she's talking to a group of Illinois high school math teachers about the philosophy of Common Core math. Listen to this. It's a very short clip.
But even under the new Common Core, even if they said 3 times 4 was 11, if they were able to explain their reasoning and explain how they came up with their answer really in words and in oral explanations, and they showed it in the picture, but they just got the final number wrong, we're really more focusing on the how and the way.
And that's it. Right answers don't matter in this curriculum. It's not about kids getting the right answer because most kids can't do complicated math and get the right answer. What this is about is making kids feel sociologically comfortable with what math they do know. All right, and so there's one more video I want to show you on this. And you can find thousands like this on the internet, but I only have time to show you one. This is an important one for Professor Milgram because the woman in the video is a college math professor. And she cannot help her 3rd grade daughter with math. Not because she doesn't understand it, because of the absolutely screwy way Common Core requires it be done. Did you hear what that woman just said? If they can show in the pictures what they thought, it doesn't matter if they get the answer right or wrong. Well, let's watch this short clip and you'll see exactly what she means by that. Go this way, go this way.
But
and all right, here we go. Here's the difficult math question. Just add those three numbers. This girl's a third grader. 1568, 1423, and 680. Just add those three
So what
numbers.
I want you to do is, can you solve that problem showing me the way that you learned how to solve it in school?
Okay.
And talk to me while you're solving it.
So we learned that a big square like this is 100. So we could make that 100 into a cube, which would make 1,000.
So if a square equals 100, then a cube equals 1,000.
So let's just say that's 1,000. And now we still have to do 500. Could make that into 5 sheets.
Do you notice how nobody's adding anything? This is just what you have to do to get the first number on the board. So 5 sheets equals 500. The straight lines equal 10, and the dots equal ones. So now you got to put the second number on the board.
For her birthday, she got 1,000. The dots represent 1.
Okay.
So now we have to add all of these together. So you could make 1,000. All of these together is 400. Now you need 600 more. So now I'm going to write the numbers down. So we have 1,000 plus, or let's just say 3,000 because we have 3 cubes. 3,000 plus 100, 200, 300. So now we can erase all these sheets and hundreds and tens and say. So we could just add, and that gives us a total of 3,763.
Okay. Now that problem you just solved took about 8 minutes.
Yeah,
8 minutes.
That's what we're doing in school. But at home, I'm taught how to stack, and we're not allowed to do stacking in school. That's
You
why
are
we have to
prohibited
figure
from
out
doing stacking
Okay.
math in Common Core. If you
So
do it,
I'm
you get it wrong.
going to
Stacking is how
stack
you and I
these
learn.
numbers, which is way easy.
That's it. You cannot do that kind of math in Common Core. Prohibited, right?
What are you thinking? You're looking at your problems.
I got 2 different answers.
You got 2 different answers. What do you think happened?
Maybe I counted wrong.
Looks like you did the stacking correctly, and that took you about a minute.
So I think I did something messed up on this sheet.
What do you think happened?
Well, since that way was more confusing.
All right. Out of the mouths of babes, right? God bless her. But you know the serious ramifications of this. Milgram points out that in every high-achieving math country on Earth, kids routinely start serious algebra in 7th grade or even 6th. In No Child Left Behind America, kids did not routinely start algebra till 8th grade. Under Common Core, algebra is pushed into high school. And you know what that means? That means your kids will not be able to take calculus and advanced math in high school. Because if you're not starting algebra in 9th grade, you'll never get there. And that's exactly what Professor Milgram says. And by the way, if you're taking notes, write this name down. Jason Zimba, Z-I-M-B-A. He is the man most responsible, singularly responsible for Common Core math. And in a recent newspaper article 2 months ago, he admits it. He says that it's true. Common Core will not prepare your kids for college-level math. He said the very bright ones might be ready to start math at a 2-year technical college, maybe. Let me, in trying to be respectful of time, I know you got questions, but we have one quick little presentation after mine. Let me get my allotted stuff in, and I'll stick around and answer the questions, I promise. but I just want to make sure, because not everybody can stay late, so I want to be respectful of your time. This is the problem with Common Core math. And here's the other thing. If Common Core math, if it was always done that way, if a cube always equaled 1,000, then we could figure it out. Even I could figure it out and help my kids. But it's never done the same way twice. Sometimes it's squiggly lines and dots and dashes. You won't believe this. In one Wisconsin elementary school, kids are taught how to add and subtract by drawing cows, because we are the dairy state, drawing cows. And you have to draw for every single problem enough cows so that you can count the legs to get the answer right. And if you don't draw the cows, you don't get credit for it. Right? And this is the thing. When I asked Professor Milgram this, look, I don't want to be glib about this. I understand that not all kids learn the same way. I get it. But why would you not let them do it the simple way first? And then for kids who need extra help, let them do it. I told you, in third grade, for whatever reason, I had a college-level reading ability. And they let me read big books. That's probably why I entered the high finance world of English professor. But as I pointed out to you, in third grade, my math skills were decidedly second grade, and they still are. I mean, I can balance a checkbook, calculate a tip, and that's the end of it. But so what? One of the preferred ways of doing Common Core math, particularly right now it's big in Florida, New York, and Kentucky, is what you do in elementary schools is you don't teach kids math. You put them in little groups of 2 and 3. The teachers give the kids a problem. And the purpose of the math assignment is not to get the right answer. It's to get all 3 kids in the group to agree on what the answer is. We actually have an exam from a mom in New York. She mailed it to us. A little boy, third grader, 6 times 7, he writes 42. He got it marked wrong. And the teacher said, in red pencil, the other 2 kids in your peer group agreed on a different answer. Because they agreed with each other, they got it marked right. Because this little boy failed to agree with his peers, he got it marked wrong. Another little boy, 4th grader, in an addition problem, he came up with an answer for an addition problem that was 111. He got it marked wrong because he wrote 111 rather than drawing the required 111 circles to get the correct answer. Okay? This is what Common Core math is. And as Milgram rightly points out, there's no reason for this. We have created a math curriculum, and the one thing that you can say about it is moms and dads can't help their kids with it. That's the feature of it. Here's what I would tell you. For the first time tonight, I'm going to give you my 2 cents on something. This is the first time. You know what Common Core is? For the last 40 years, our kids have gotten their ABCs and their 1, 2, 3s. But in getting them, we know, right? They've been quietly being pushed politically over the last 4. It's undeniable, right? The politics, the sex, the attitudes, to everything from abortion to government to war, they're being pushed. But the ABCs were there, and then there's a subtle push. I believe categorically, and Milgram seconded me on this when I asked him about it, that for the first time now, here's what Common Core is revolutionarily doing. Now the ABCs and the 1, 2, 3s don't even matter as much as the ideology. Now for the first time, the ideological and sociological aspects of the schools trump even the pedagogy. And can't you already see it? Why all the sex in the schools? Why all the graphicness? Why the violence? Why the radical political agenda? Why all the government handout documents to be read in place of neutral? Literature is wonderful because it's mostly neutral. You read the great books of the Western world, right? And they're not preaching politics to you. You read Shakespeare and Milton and Toni Morrison at their best. These writers are neutral politically. But this stuff that you're getting in place of that curriculum now, all these pamphlets and executive orders, then you see the math, right? I've got a doctor in Green Bay, friend of mine. She's the only person in the last 20 years to get 100% on her MCAT, her math test for medical school. She's the only one in 20 years. And she took it in 8th grade. She was that good in math, the MCAT. She can't help her 5th grader with math. Because how do you do it with this stuff? And you know what's really shocking here? And I can't get the full picture on there, but I can read it to you. This is from the, you can see it. This is from the Irvine Unified School District in Orange County, California. The entire school district just north of here. That is north of here, right? Yeah, just north of here. South. Is it south? No, south of here. Good, thank you. South of here. What happened was in 4th grade, by the time kids were reaching 4th grade in the Irvine School District, they couldn't add and subtract independently. Moms were freaking out. So what moms started doing was hiring tutors and making their kids work on math. And the school freaked out. This is one of 25 different school districts across the country who are now warning and threatening moms and dads not to let their kids work ahead. This is directly from the Irvine Unified School District website. Here's what it says. The links on this page are intended to support the classroom instruction that your child receives from his or her teacher. It is not appropriate to go ahead of the classroom or to have your child use this site to work on math that is intended for subsequent grade levels. There's the warning. You do not use this to get ahead. Here's the threat, the actual threat to moms and dads. Your child's math instruction and placement will not change as a result of working ahead. This means that your child will continue to work in the grade level appropriate math regardless of any work that is turned into your teacher. So I don't care if your kid can do calculus in 3rd grade. I don't care if he will stay drawing these ridiculous cubes and circles. You do not let them get ahead. Now do you see, right? This is pure sociology. It's not designed to help kids get ahead in math. It's not fair. You know what? It was cosmically unfair that in 3rd grade I could read that well. So we'll make sure now that kids in 3rd grade who can read that well have to keep reading Beezus and Ramona for the next 6 years. And what would have happened to my ability in English, writing, and language if I was stuck in 3rd grade reading the same things that what would have happened to it? And what's going to happen to those kids who can do math when they are told now, I don't care what math you can do, you will sit here, you will work with your peers, you will not leap ahead, and you got 25 different American schools now threatening moms and dads not to help their kids get ahead? That may be the most shocking thing I've shown you yet. And this is right down the road. Now, I know it's south. Right down the road in California. All right, now we're almost done. We're down to the 3rd part of my little talk here. I'm sure you've all heard about data mining. Well, one of the consequences of taking Race to the Top money is in taking Race to the Top, you are now mandated. You have to report data and sensitive information on your school kids to the federal government. That's for taking the money. This is the facility the feds just built in Utah. It was finished last year. This facility, multi-billion-dollar facility, they built it in the desert of Utah. That's where they're going to store all your kids' data that they're going to mine on him or her. Now you think about this. When you and I went to school, the only thing that ever appeared on our transcripts was our final grades. Under Common Core, every test, every quiz grade, every assignment, every teacher comment, every single conduct evaluation. If your kid has ADHD or is on Ritalin or is dyslexic or is slow learning to pronounce his D's and R's, that all gets put in the formal record. And the feds have already said they intend to make all of these records available to employers when your kids go to get jobs. So think about this. Under Obamacare, what? Your kids are kids till they're 27 now, right? So at 28, when your kid goes to get his first job, what's going to happen? So your kid's, whether he's applying to deliver pizzas or whether he's applying to be a tech at IBM, the employers are going to be able to access their complete data file. And for competitive jobs like that, so your kid was on Adderall when he was 8, or your kid had a dyslexia problem when he's 12, this is now going to be among conduct evaluations. Your kid had a bad year when he was 7, or when he hit puberty, all that testosterone freaked him out for a year. All this becomes now public record for the employers. The people of Utah are so disgusted by this that they're trying to pass a state ordinance to cut off water supply to this building. It's great. Quickly. Yes. Yeah, you've got them in California. It's not quite as elaborate as that one. But the thing about the water is really important. Do you know, to run this building in the Utah desert, it takes 1 million gallons of water a day to cool all those computers. It's just nothing but huge complexes of computers. And there's our environmentally happy president, right? That our happy legislators at the state, at the national level. 1 million gallons of water to cool these computers every day. You understand why the people of Utah don't have that water to spare, and they don't want this stuff there. But this is the data mining. Bill Gates, by the way, Bill Gates just came out. The other thing about this that's so maddening is if you just listen to you shouldn't have to hear this from me. Just listen to what they're telling you. Bill Gates 2 weeks ago came out and he wants this kind of data mining for college kids. We must data mine college kids from the time they hit campus till 10 years after they graduate. Start gathering all this information. So if Bill Gates gets his way, we're going to start data mining kids at age 3 when mandatory pre-K kicks in, all the way till they're 26 or 27 or 30 after they get out of college. In other words, this is a huge extension of what the feds are already doing in terms of gathering stuff. And so if you look at the Department of Education's own documents, Pay attention to this one. Look at the title of this. It was written in February of 2013, just about a year ago. And the title of this is Promoting Grit, Tenacity, and Perseverance. This is how your kid succeeds in education in the 21st century. Is that what education is to you? Something you got to persevere? Is that our attitude towards education? It's the federal government's. Grit it out. When I hear the word grit, I always imagine John Wayne getting a bullet dug out of his thigh. Grit it out, persevere, be tenacious like a tick, and you can understand if you're a kid who can do math, can you imagine what this is going to do to you? You're a kid who can read or wants to read. This is their argument. And if you turn to the 43rd page of this document, you can find it online. You turn to the 43rd page of this document, here are some of the ways they want to not just ask your kids questions, but they want to biologically measure and meter your kids when they're learning. Is any of this in California? I've been told yes, but I can't independently. I've had moms up north in California who've written me and shown me things, but I haven't independently verified it yet. But I tell you what, is it in New York schools? Absolutely. Is it in Florida schools? Kentucky schools? Absolutely. The one on the right, that's basically a blood pressure cuff. And it was the geniuses adapted it to fit a little kid's wrist. It measures blood pressure, pulse, and heart rate. In other words, it's a very, very crude lie detector. And what they're doing is they're putting that on little kids' wrists when they ask them all these questions. We've got a mom from New York, 13-year-old daughter, came home with a purple bruise on her wrist. It's the only way mom knew. They had it on too tight. And mom said, "What happened to you?" "Well, mom, one of the vice principals and the student nurse put her in a room. They hooked that up to her arm. They had it on too tight. And they asked her dozens and dozens of questions, including questions like, do your parents vote? Did they vote in the last election? Who did they vote for in the last election? Are there guns in your house? Would you feel better if somebody from the school took those guns away? Are your parents divorced? This little girl's parents were. Would you feel better if the school helped you live with the parent of your choice? And dozens more. Almost nothing whatsoever to do with education, with learning. The facial expression camera on the left. Be careful when your states go to this, and because Bill Gates is pushing this. Let's get a laptop in every kid's hand. Let's get an iPad for every kid. And we think, wow, you know what? We learned really, really, really well for a long time without any of that stuff. But they've got now, be careful, because when you take those initiatives, you're going to get like what happened in one entire Pennsylvania school district, high school district, where kids were told at the beginning of this term last year, no school supplies, no papers, no pencils. The only school supply is a laptop computer, and you cannot provide your own. So when the kids showed up in class the first day, they were all issued state laptops, and the moms and dads were charged $650 for the use of them in a public school. Those laptop computers contained NASA quality global positioning information, keystroke recognition technology. In other words, every single key ever struck on that computer while it was in your kid's possession became part of your kid's file. Now, it's like the NSA. The federal government is capturing all these phone conversations, but they can't possibly listen to them all. They dump them in files, right? So that if somebody ever accuses you of being a terrorist, they can see what they've got in your file, and if necessary, start unpacking the phone calls. It's the same thing here. Nobody is sitting there watching your daughter when she does her math homework, but they could. And that's the cameras. These laptops, when you opened them and turned them on, they all had where the camera would be at the top of the laptop, they had recording cameras. Every time that laptop was turned on, it automatically was filming anyone who walked in front of the screen or anybody who was watching it. And again, I'm not suggesting to you that there's a principal sitting somewhere in his office watching your 8th grader in her nightgown do her math homework. But if for any reason whatsoever they needed to go into your kid's file, they could get anything that was done on that computer they'd have. They're already doing this across the country. Posture analysis seats. Do certain topics cause your kids to slouch down in their chairs? The pressure mouse, right? Do certain subjects or issues cause your kid's hand to sweat or grab the mouse more? Do you know that Bill Gates is right now trying to he's funding it, research into creating an MRI scan for classroom use? They want to be able to hook your kids up to brain scans while they're learning and reading and listening to find out things about them. This is already in the works, right? This is a huge problem with Common Core. And then there's this. And I want you to help me. This is the last thing we're going to see, this last little segment. I want you to help me with this document. These are the National Sexuality Education Standards. They're national. This document was written in 2012 and published in September of 2012, right coterminous with the beginning of Common Core. Right when Common Core was being put in, this was crafted. Now you tell me, what does that mean? If they're the national sexuality standards, who owns them? The feds. If they're standards, that means what's the way they're going to be able to they're going to have to measure them? Tests. Look at the subtitle of that document. What does that tell you? This is core content. Oh, I don't see the word common, but it's core content. These are the content, core content and sexual skills that they're going to teach your kids starting at age 5 years old. You can see that up on the screen. They start in kindergarten through high school. And if you're not in the bag, you can see the whole thing up there too. These are the sexuality standards. They're national. Do you teach your kids about sex at age 5? Because they're doing it now. And if you open this document to the 6th page, you can find this online. Go open it to page 6. You'll see this. When they wrote them, the national sexuality standards were informed by the work of. When they put the national sex standards together, they consulted other things to write them. Take a look at the last thing on that list. The Common Core State Standards for English and Math. Can you explain to me why the national sexuality standards were written with consulting English and math? You remember that question I left hanging about 10 minutes ago? Why is there so much developmentally inappropriate sex and violence in Common Core? Well, this is why. Because the national sexuality standards, I've read the whole 60-page document. The national sexuality standards were never meant to be rolled out as a separate curriculum. California's adopted English and math and science. Now here come the sex standards, and we just won't take them. Nuh-uh. This, you can tell it right there. Because there were a whole bunch of, we had non-Common Core science. How come they didn't consult that? We had non-Common Core history in 2012. How come they didn't consult that? What did they consult? Common Core English and math. Because that was the only Common Core standards we had at the time. And what this curriculum is meant to do, these standards, is they're going to teach them in every Common Core subject. Every Common Core subject, including English and math and science and history, and yes, even art and gym and music are now going to have a sexual component to them. They're going to have to. How else are you going to get your kids to the standards? Look, and they start at 5-year-olds. And what this document does is it breaks your kids up into 3-year cycles. 5, 6, and 7-year-olds, test. 8, 9, and 10-year-olds, test. 11, 12, and 13-year-olds, test. They break them up into cycles that way. We don't put 5-year-olds in biology class. We don't have, for 6-year-olds, a sex ed class. The only way they're going to get your kids to these standards is if every single aspect of the Common Core curriculum becomes sexualized. Look at some of the ways math story problems are phrased. And you're going to be shocked by why in the world are they talking about sex? Why in the world are they talking about alternative marriages? Why are they talking about gay marriage in math? Why are they talking about transgender people in basic 4th grade story problems? And the reason they're doing it is because that's the only place you have to get the kids to the standards. Let me show you just a couple of the standards. Because my personal belief is that I don't want my public schools teaching my kids about sex, period. But even if you want to disagree with me, no, Pesta, we need kids to learn about sperm and egg. Or, no, we need kids to learn about condoms. I don't agree with you, but we can have that debate. But even if you think it's a good idea for public school kids to learn that stuff, these standards have nothing to do with any of it. Here are some of the standards for 5, 6, and 7-year-olds, taken right from the document. By the time your daughter's 7, she will be able to identify different kinds of family structures, but she's also going to have to demonstrate ways to show respect for different types of families. That's the standard. Who gets to define what respect is? And there's a reason you don't teach your 5 and 6-year-olds about marriage or gay marriage or transgender marriage. You don't teach your 5-year-olds about single mother homes or single father homes. We don't do it because kids that young have no ability to process what you're talking about. You're teaching kids that young this stuff. You are not teaching them anything. You're encoding things in their brains. They're starting at 5 this is pure sociology. So you're going to expose them to all the different kinds of family structures, and you are going to compel them to respect different kinds of families. And what if your definition of what marriage is differs from the state's now? What happens then? This is the national test, right? This is the national standard. They are already using this as a litmus test. Do you know why did Indiana pull out first? Do you know in Indiana there have already been 2 examples of warrantless home searches based on students disagreeing with what they're being taught in school? 2, this is all in the news. In Indiana, you've had teachers calling federal agents when there's a conflict between what the teachers are trying to teach them about sexuality and what they're learning or not learning at home. When moms and dads object to this, twice now, state agents have been dispatched to Indiana homes without warrants because of this kind of stuff. Because we're rapidly getting to the point where if your kids don't believe what they're being, and these are the standards, they're national standards they're being tested by. How about this? By the time your daughter's 7, describe differences and similarities in how boys and girls may be expected to act. Because you know, right, that if math isn't true or false, then there is no such thing as gender either. There is not male, there is not female. There's no such thing. You're living in the Jerry Brown days, right? Isn't Jerry Brown the guy who passed the first law of its kind last year? Where any kid at whatever age who shows up in a public school and just declares she's the opposite gender, she's got to be able to play for the opposite sports teams, she's got to be able to use the opposite restrooms and showers. That's what this is. You're going to teach kids as young as 5 and 6 and 7 that gender's a meaningless construct. How about this next one? We would not ask a question like this to college kids. It is so broad and vague. But these little girls at age 7, you're going to have to provide examples of how friends, family, media, society, and culture influence ways that boys and girls think they should. You're going to send your 6-year-old to the internet for a sex and gender search? This is Orwellian. Starting at 5, 6, and 7. How about for 10th graders? Before your kids have even hit puberty, when they're 10-year-olds, when they're in 5th grade, before they've even hit puberty, here's what they're going to have to do. Look at the second one here. They will, for the test, they will define sexual orientation as the romantic attraction of an individual to someone of the same gender or someone of a different gender. Now, look, I'm an agnostic on the whole question of gay marriage. I don't have a dog in the fight personally. Did that make me a bad person? Maybe so. But I'm telling you what, there's no way on earth they should be teaching this, not you, to your kids. You have the right. What happens if you're an evangelical Christian or a devout Catholic? What happens if you're an Orthodox Jew, or the one I can't wait to see? What happens if you're a devout Quranic Muslim? But you know, the thing about them, with all due respect, the thing about the Muslims that they've got 100% right is they don't put their kids in American public schools. They educate them. That's something we need to return to. That they've got it all right on that, in that sense. Their kids will not be subjected to this. Your kids will be. And this is the thing that's so shocking. This is pure 100% sociology. Do you see what this is? This is I told you my definition of it earlier. That if you force me to define Common Core, and we're just about done, if you force me to define Common Core in one word, that one word would be statism. It is convincing your kids at every level and in every way that they belong primarily to the state and not to you. That the state's responsible for their sexual well-being. The state determines morality now, the role of government now. Only state math teachers are going to be able to help your kids with these ridiculous math problems. Everything devolves to the state. That's when I said that I think for the first time, now the ideology is superseding everything else. How about this? Let's just take a brief moment and look at the ways in which they're going to teach this to your kids. This is taken directly from the administrative part of the document. Here's what we need. Instruction by qualified sexuality education teachers is essential for student achievement. So, if sex is now going to be taught in every subject area, what is already beginning to happen is your daughter, if she wants to be an English teacher, a middle school English teacher, before she can graduate, she has to have a module about teaching sex in English affixed to her curriculum. If your kid wants to be a high school math teacher, he's going to have to learn in school, before he does the student teaching, how to teach sex through math. Look at the next one. Students need opportunities to engage in cooperative and active learning strategies with regards to the sex standards. How about this one? Sufficient time must be allocated for students to practice skills relating to sexuality educations. How about the next one? Students need multiple opportunities and a variety of assessment strategies to determine their achievement of the sexuality education standards and performance. This is the doc. Now, can you say this is Common Core categorically? I'll tell you what I think. You can say it is Common Core. You can say it's the same thing. The one thing you cannot say is this is not Common Core. because the only place they have to teach this in is in the Common Core classroom. And let me show you, the next thing, is the most graphic thing, well, one of the most graphic things I'm going to show you is next. I want to demonstrate to you that this is already in the schools. And not even in places like Berkeley, California, or hippy-dippy Madison, Wisconsin. This poster, there's a poster I'm going to show you. It hangs on the front of the wall, right above the blackboard, in a Shawnee, Kansas middle school. It was a 6th grade girl in the class who took the picture. This poster has hung there all semester. It's right next to a picture of Clifford the Big Red Dog in middle school. Here is the poster that hangs, and remember, Shawnee, Kansas is the middle of the Bible Belt. Here is the poster that hangs on the wall in Shawnee, Kansas. I hate doing this in a church, but I got pastor's permission, right? Because as Pastor rightly said, if they're showing this to 6th graders, you better see it, because you wouldn't believe it if I told you about it. The title of the poster is, How Do People Express Their Sexual Feelings? And this is such a microcosm of Common Core English, because notice how they've got talking on there twice. Proofreading, spelling, we don't care about that. So how do people express their sexual feelings? Talking. Did you know, look at the list. Do you know now saying I like you to somebody is sexual? Did you know that? Dancing is sexual, hugging is sexual. And look at the other things on that list. 6th grader took the picture. You see what this is? And how about this one? For a public school system obsessed with birth control to the point of fetishization, do you notice how there's not the slightest suggestion that certain things on that list might result in pregnancy or might result in disease? You know what this is? This is a threat. If your kid accepts any of those as legitimate, then he must accept all of them. And if your kid rejects any one of those things, he is rejecting all of them. This is an absolute radical writing. Morality, modesty, shame, innocence. This is taking it all away in favor of a radical mainstreaming of every single kind of sex. It's all the same thing. Now there's a complete moral equivalency here between saying I like you to somebody and sodomizing them. That's the moral equivalence. And it was, let me remind you, 6th graders are 10 and 11 years old. That's where the poster hangs. Even more shocking than the poster is the response from the school when Dad predictably freaked out. Here's what happened when Dad freaked out. He got the following letter, it's cut off at the bottom there, from Hawker Grove Middle School spokeswoman Leanne Neal of Shawnee, Kansas. And if you want to verify I'm not making it up, you can kind of look over there and see it. And here's what the middle school wrote back to Dad. The poster that you reference is actually part of our middle school health and science materials, and so it is a part of our district-approved curriculum. Where did it come from? The curriculum is a part of aligns with the national standards around those issues. It comes right from the national sexuality standards. And so it stays, and it's there today, right, for 6th graders. Last little thing then, 2 little things. Gets a little worse before it gets better. This book, we're almost done, is It's Perfectly Normal. Now I'm going to tell you, this book precedes Common Core. It was first published by Planned Parenthood in 1998. But I'll tell you now, I've seen about 50 different copies of this book in about 12 different states that have been published, because every time I go to a talk, people bring it up to me. This book, when it's been published in the last 2 years, on the inside right cover, stamped in red ink, is Common Core approved. This is one of those Common Core approved books, right, that can be read in English class. And it's all about teaching 4th graders how to masturbate. And so when you open the book to the first page, what you see is naked people. And notice how egalitarian this is. You've got fat naked people and skinny naked people, short naked people, tall naked people, black naked people, white naked people, handicapped naked people, even little baby naked people. And this is the visual equivalent of what that poster is. It's perfectly normal. Get used to it, right? Naked is naked, that's a good thing. And you actually go so far in this book when you turn the page to have actual pictures of little girls and boys pleasuring themselves for 4th graders. And every version I've seen of this published in the last 2 years I haven't seen all of them, I haven't even seen most of them, but every one I've seen is stamped Common Core approved. Right? All of this is all part of one big plan. It's not a separate bunch of entities. And then, I'm going to get off that picture there. Hold on, I got to go back, because I got to set this up first.
I'm a licensed clinical
All right, so you're going to have to look at that for one more minute. This is it. This is the end now. Not surprisingly, this has been going on for 2 years longer in places like Florida, New York, and Kentucky. We have a document with over 250 clinical psychologists from all across the country, developmental psychologists, signing petitions begging states to get out of this because it is developmentally inappropriate. It is beginning to wreck kids' minds. It is messing with them. Bad things are happening, and it all stems from the tests. I'm going to show you one. This is Dr. Mary Calamia from New York. She is testifying before the New York Senate Select Committee on Common Core. Maybe after you listen to her short testimony, you will see why even a very progressive state like New York is now desperately trying to get out of this. Here's what Dr. Mary said happened in her psych. She didn't even know what Common Core was. And all of a sudden, 3 and 4 years ago when this started, little kids started coming to her doing really bad things to themselves. And she had to figure out what was going on. Over 250 people like this have made videos and signed petitions. Here's Dr. Mary.
Good afternoon. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and I'm a psychotherapist. I work with parents, children, and about half of my caseload is teachers also. My caseload represents about 20 different school districts in Suffolk County. In the fall of 2012, my phone started ringing. I started getting an inordinate number of referrals of students, a lot of honors students, 8th graders mostly, who were self-mutilating. They were cutting themselves with sharp objects, and they were burning themselves with cigarettes. My phone never stopped. And I didn't know why. I asked the kids, and all they kept saying was, "We can't take the pressure, it's too much." I also started getting a lot of elementary school students referred to me. They were refusing to go to school. They said they felt stupid and that school was too hard. They were throwing tantrums, begging to stay home, and upset to the point of vomiting. I was hearing from parents about kids bringing home homework they couldn't help them with. I was alarmed to hear that in some cases there were no textbooks for the parents to look at, and they had no idea what their children were learning. The teachers were reporting a staggering level of anxiety and depression, and that was when I first heard the term Common Core and learned about the standards that we now say set the bar so high anyone can walk right under it. Everyone was talking about the tests. As the school year progressed and the tests loomed, my patients were increasing their self-mutilating behaviors. They were complaining of insomnia, panic attacks, loss of appetite, depressed mood, and in one case, suicidal thoughts that resulted in a 2-week hospital stay for an adolescent. We can't regulate biology. Young children cannot engage in the type of critical thinking that the Common Core calls for. That would require a fully developed prefrontal cortex, a part of the brain that is not fully functional until adulthood. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for critical thinking, rational decision-making, and abstract thought, all things that the Common Core requires prematurely. We give children pre-assessments, tell them to succeed, and then give them tests on material they haven't learned and tell them it's okay to fail. They cannot resolve that mixed message. Last spring, a 6-year-old encountered a multiplication sign on the NWEA first grade math exam and asked the teacher what it was. The teacher was not allowed to help him and told him to just do his best. From that point on, the student's test performance went downhill. He couldn't shake off the unfamiliar symbol and couldn't believe his teacher wouldn't help him. The Common Core requires children to read informational texts that are owned by a handful of corporations. They don't have a filter to distinguish good information from bad. So whatever you put in front of them, they take that as gospel. They're literal. So when we give them a textbook that explains the Second Amendment as the people have the right to keep and bear arms in a state militia, they will look no further for clarification. We ask them to write critically using emotionally charged language to persuade instead of inform. They don't have that functional prefrontal cortex. So they tap into their limbic system, which is the part of the brain that involves basic human